Welcome back to History in Ashes, where we sift through the dust and quiet ruins of the past to find the stories that shaped our world. Tonight, we are stepping into a chapter of history that still chills the mind. Not because it began with tanks rolling or storms of violence, but because its earliest signs were so ordinary that most people walked past them without noticing. Before the world knew the name Adolf Hitler, before Germany became synonymous with terror, there were tiny, nearly invisible steps that led a society toward one of the darkest transformations in human history. One of the most unsettling truths about the rise of the Nazi regime is that it did not begin with dramatic declarations. It began with forgotten meetings in beer halls, with small crowds listening to speeches that most German newspapers found too trivial to cover. It began with a shattered nation where bread could cost a wheelbarrow's worth of banknotes and where desperate parents fed their children watery soup, hoping it would be enough to keep them alive through the night. And perhaps most haunting of all, it began with millions of people who believed they were making small, practical decisions that would simply help them survive another week. They never imagined those decisions would help empower a movement that would reshape the world through devastation. As we step into this journey together, take a breath, settle in, and let the soft quiet of the night carry you deeper into history. Because the world we are entering was once filled with people who longed for normalcy, who wanted predictable routines, steady incomes, and a sense of belonging, and in the thick of their exhaustion, they missed the warning signs rising around them. Before we go deeper, friends, if you are listening right now, could you do something gentle and simple for us? Slip down to the comments and tell us where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. We love knowing how far this little community reaches, from quiet living rooms to night shift break rooms to those late night study marathons where history keeps you company. And while you are there, well, you might want to subscribe. We would say it softly, but since we are talking about the rise of a political party that practically demanded loyalty oaths, let us just say this. Unlike those guys, we will not force you, but without your support, this channel will absolutely perish in the digital wilderness. So, if you enjoy being here, tap that button. We promise no uniforms, no salutes, just history. Now, let us return to Germany in the years after the Great War, when the world was still staggering from wounds that had not yet begun to heal. The conflict that ended in the autumn of 1918 had taken millions of lives, collapsed empires, and reshaped borders across Europe. Germany, once proud and industrially powerful, found itself under the crushing weight of defeat. The Treaty of Versailles demanded reparations so immense that no nation in modern history had ever been forced to pay anything comparable. Entire communities felt the strain. Cities that once buzzed with workers now echoed with the quiet shuffle of the unemployed. The humiliation was not just political or economic, it was personal. Many Germans carried a deep sense of betrayal, convinced that something had gone terribly wrong, not just in the war, but in the identity of their nation. In those fragile years, Germany's newly formed democratic government, the Weimar Republic, struggled to steady itself. It was a government born out of necessity, not consensus. Its early leaders faced a population that did not yet agree on what democracy even meant, or whether it was worth defending. To some, it felt weak. To others, it felt unfamiliar. And to many more, it felt hopelessly disconnected from their daily suffering. Poverty had seeped into homes like winter, cold slowly at first, then completely. Unemployment soared. Food shortages became common. Families sold heirlooms, coats, jewelry, anything that could be exchanged for a few potatoes or a loaf of bread. Imagine what ordinary life felt like in those years. Picture a schoolteacher who once carried herself with quiet pride, now taking on extra work just to afford enough butter to make a meal feel warm. Picture a veteran sitting in the corner of a crowded beer hall, staring into a half-empty mug, wondering why the glory he had been promised dissolved into ash. Picture entire neighborhoods where children wore shoes patched so many times that the original material had vanished beneath layers of cloth and twine. These were not dramatic moments. They were slow, grinding struggles, the kind that wear down a society not through sudden blows but through endless, dull pressure. And because these struggles were shared by so many, they became almost normal. People adapted, as people always do. They learned to stretch ingredients, to barter with neighbors, to wait in long lines for coal, to sew their coats thicker for the winter. Survival became an everyday skill, not an extraordinary act. But within this exhaustion, there was something dangerous, a longing for simple answers. Into this atmosphere came a flood of small political parties, each promising to fix everything quickly. There were nationalists, communists, monarchists, separatists, and dozens of fringe groups with barely a handful of members. Germany felt like a political flea market, noisy and chaotic, with each group shouting for attention. Most of these groups remained insignificant, remembered now only in footnotes and faded posters. But one of them, at the time, a tiny collection of frustrated men meeting in the smoky back rooms of Munich, would change the course of global history. It is easy to imagine that when a movement becomes dangerous, people would notice. But the truth is often the opposite. In the early years, the German Workers' Party was so obscure that local newspapers did not bother to cover their gatherings. They had no uniforms, no nationwide presence, and no coherent strategy. They were, in many ways, simply another voice in the crowded chorus of anger and disappointment. The shocking thing is not how powerful they became, but how ordinary they seemed at first. When Adolf Hitler first encountered the group, he was not yet a leader. He was an army informant sent to observe their activities, a quiet assignment given to a man who had returned from the front lines feeling directionless. What he found in that tiny meeting was chaos, but also opportunity. He discovered that he had a talent for speaking, for stirring emotions, for turning frustration into energy. His speeches, at first delivered to small audiences, began to draw more people, not because the message was truly unique, but because he expressed it with a fierce conviction that stood out in a weary time. Still, even then, most Germans barely noticed. The party's early years were marked by petty arguments, financial instability, and constant reorganization. It was a movement built from scraps, leftover resentments, borrowed ideas, and ambitions that felt too large for the rooms they met in. What made it dangerous was not its strength, but its persistence. And so, in these early post-war years, as Germany struggled to define its identity, a shadow began to grow behind the cluttered political landscape. Slowly, quietly, and almost imperceptibly, the conditions that would allow a dictatorship to rise were taking shape. Hunger, humiliation, political fragmentation, and the longing for stability were weaving together into a fabric that could be easily pulled apart by anyone bold enough to promise order. As you listen to these early threads of the story, you might wonder something that historians still debate today. At what point should people have realized what was coming? Was it in the quiet desperation of breadlines, in the angry shouts of beer hall speeches, or in the exhaustion of families trying to survive one more impossible year? Or was it hidden even earlier, in the silent spaces where small decisions accumulate, unnoticed, until they form the foundations of something vast and irreversible? In the years following those early struggles, the political landscape of Germany continued to fracture, leaving ordinary citizens feeling as though they were walking through a maze with no clear exit. Deep inside this confusion, a movement that had once been little more than a collection of restless men in beer halls began to take on a more definite shape. But its growth was not explosive or dramatic. It was slow, uneven, and filled with moments so subtle that most Germans would barely remember them later. These small steps, however, were precisely the kind that matter most when a society begins to drift toward extremism. To understand how this transformation happened, we have to look at the strange world of political clubs and paramilitary groups that filled German cities in those years. Every major gathering place, from taverns to rented halls to community centers, played host to political arguments. Flyers littered the streets, posters clung to walls on every corner. Everyone had an opinion, and nearly every opinion was shaped by worry. Some citizens feared communists, others feared monarchists. Many simply feared that their lives would never return to the stability they once knew. In this noisy environment, almost any group could find an audience, even if only for an evening. It was within this environment that the German Workers' Party, still tiny and disorganized, continued trying to make itself heard. Their earliest gatherings were humble to the point of embarrassment. A few chairs, borrowed tables, and worn pamphlets were all they had. Their membership was scattered, with some men motivated by anger, some by curiosity, and some by a vague sense that Germany's decline demanded a new kind of leadership. But even in these unremarkable beginnings, the movement attracted people who believed they could mold the group into something larger. Among these men was Anton Drexler, a railway worker who held strong nationalist views and believed Germany could only rise again through unity and traditional values. Drexler lacked charisma, but he had determination, the kind of determination that keeps a small club alive even when most others collapse. It was Drexler who noticed the sharp-tongued army informant who attended one of their meetings and challenged a speaker with a ferocity that surprised everyone in the room. That informant was Adolf Hitler, a man who had struggled to find direction after the war, and who suddenly discovered that his talent for fiery speech could command attention. Hitler was not a leader immediately. He was simply someone who could shape scattered frustration into sentences that struck deeply. He spoke of betrayal, humiliation, and the need for national rebirth. The ideas themselves were not new, but the intensity with which he delivered them felt different. Even in those cramped, smoky rooms, people listened with a kind of nervous energy, as though they were hearing someone say aloud the things they themselves had only dared to mutter privately. Over time, Hitler's presence began to change the rhythm of the group. Meetings grew slightly larger, pamphlets improved in quality, discussions lasted longer. The party, once a hobby for men seeking an outlet for their political frustration, began to feel like it could become something more structured. And this shift did not happen because millions suddenly joined. It happened because a few dozen individuals committed themselves to building something step by step. One of the most significant changes was the introduction of propaganda. Propaganda in those early years was not the polished spectacle seen later in history. It was a patchwork of posters printed with limited funds, newspaper articles written with passionate but clumsy wording, and impromptu speeches delivered in public squares. The goal was not perfection, it was presence. The party learned that if people encountered their message repeatedly in a poster, then in a conversation, then in a speech, it would begin to feel familiar, even if they did not agree with it at first. This is one of the quiet truths of political influence. Repetition often accomplishes more than brilliance. During these years, Munich became the heart of the party's activity. The city had suffered heavily from economic instability and political violence. It was a place where extremist ideas found fertile ground because people felt exhausted by failed attempts at moderation. Many citizens simply wanted someone, anyone, to restore order and pride. In such an atmosphere, the party's message, with its blend of nationalism and blame, began to resonate. But we should not imagine that Munich suddenly flooded with supporters. The growth was modest. Meetings with 100 attendees were considered a triumph. And yet, these small victories mattered. Each new member meant another voice spreading the message, another pair of hands helping with organization, another potential donor for future projects. This was also the period in which paramilitary groups began to form around the movement. These early formations were less disciplined than they would later become, but their purpose was clear: to protect party gatherings and intimidate opponents. Street clashes between rival groups were common, though often ignored by authorities overwhelmed with other problems. These confrontations may seem like small footnotes in history, but they played a crucial role in shaping the party's identity. Violence, once scattered and reactive, became a tool, a way to show strength in a society that increasingly equated authority with force. Another important change happened behind the scenes. The party began building an administrative structure. They created membership lists, collected dues, planned events, and assigned responsibilities. These tasks were not exciting. They were the kind of bureaucratic work that rarely appears in documentaries but forms the skeleton of every political movement. Without these steps, the filing, the bookkeeping, the scheduling, no message, no matter how powerful, can spread effectively. Hitler, recognizing the importance of organization, began surrounding himself with individuals who excelled at these tasks. Some were skilled administrators, others were simply loyal. Together, they transformed the party from a loose gathering into a structured entity capable of expanding beyond Munich. Yet even as the party grew, many Germans remained skeptical or indifferent. For most families, day-to-day survival still overshadowed political ambitions. People worked long hours, worried about inflation, and saved what little they could. Politics felt distant, something that belonged to newspapers and government halls, not kitchens and workplaces. But while the general public paid little attention, the party continued to refine its identity and sharpen its message. One of the most striking developments was the evolution of Hitler's speeches. He learned to modulate his tone, moving from quiet grievances to explosive declarations. He learned when to pause, when to gesture, and when to let silence do the work. Audiences began to respond with greater enthusiasm, not because the content changed dramatically, but because the delivery made them feel part of something urgent. At the same time, the party began targeting specific groups: students frustrated with their uncertain future, veterans who felt abandoned, small business owners worried about economic instability. Each group heard a version of the message tailored to its fears. This strategy, subtle yet effective, allowed the party to grow without ever appearing overwhelming. It created the illusion that the movement reflected the voice of the people when, in reality, it was shaping those voices one conversation at a time. Through all these developments, one theme remained constant: persistence. The rise of this movement was not fueled by sudden brilliance or overwhelming support. It was built through countless small actions, meetings arranged at the last minute, speeches delivered to half-empty rooms, pamphlets distributed in the cold by volunteers who believed they were fighting for the future of their nation. History often remembers the grand moments, but the truth is that the foundations of power are usually laid through the quiet labor that no one notices until it is too late. By the early years of the 1920s, the party was still far from a dominant force, but its roots were deepening. Its message was maturing, its leaders were learning, and its followers, though still few, were becoming fiercely loyal. As we close this section, it is worth reflecting on a question that echoes through the study of every rising political movement. Is it the message that shapes the followers, or the followers that shape the message? And if both are true, then how much responsibility lies with those who speak and how much with those who listen? In those early years, when most of Germany still paid little attention to the small movement growing in Munich, something far less visible was taking place beneath the surface. Something that would one day matter more than the public rallies or fiery speeches. The movement was learning how to weave itself into the ordinary rhythms of daily life, quietly, methodically, and with a patience that history often overlooks. If the loud speeches won headlines, it was the dull administrative work that built the foundation of what would eventually become a national force. To understand this, imagine a Germany where political flyers became part of the street scenery, where a walk to the market meant passing posters plastered on crumbling walls and wooden poles, each one insisting that someone, somewhere, had the answer to the country's problems. In this environment, the emerging movement realized something important. It did not need to dominate the conversation. It only needed to be present in it. And so its members began doing the quiet tasks that would allow them to multiply their reach. Pamphlet production, for instance, became almost a ritual. Volunteers wrote, edited, and printed political messages on cheap paper. They folded stacks of them late into the night, then delivered them at dawn to cafes, workshops, university hallways, and factory gates. The content varied. Some pamphlets blamed politicians for Germany's decline, others warned about communism, and many simply promised a stronger future, but the purpose remained the same. They needed the public to see the party's name again and again until it felt familiar. But propaganda was only one part of the slow expansion. Another key strategy was building local branches across Bavaria. These branches were sometimes no more than a few men meeting in a back room, seated around a wooden table with scratched surfaces and uneven legs. They took minutes, kept records, collected membership dues, and discussed outreach plans with a seriousness that far outweighed their numbers. For many of these men, the party gave them a sense of belonging that the uncertain world outside could not. Even the creation of a newspaper became part of this slow, deliberate rise. The newspaper did not begin as a polished publication. Early issues were thin, filled with repetitive language, and printed with ink that sometimes smudged before it dried. Yet they served a crucial purpose. They allowed the party to frame events in a way that supported their message. Every economic setback, every political disagreement, every scandal in the Weimar government became fuel for the narrative they were constructing, that Germany needed strength, unity, discipline, and a leader who could restore pride. These efforts might sound unremarkable, almost mundane, But history often turns on the work that nobody celebrates: the endless meetings, the tedious bookkeeping, the careful recruitment of people who would later become key organizers. Step by step, the movement was transforming from a fringe club into something capable of reaching beyond Munich. One of the most significant tools for this growth was the party's developing system of public speeches. In the earliest years, Hitler spoke mostly in small halls, where the air smelled of spilled beer and the walls were stained from years of smoke. But as word spread, the crowds grew, and with larger crowds came the need for better planning. Members organized ticket sales, arranged seating, and coordinated with sympathetic owners of halls who rented their spaces for reduced fees. These gatherings were not just political events, they became social rituals. People came to listen, to argue, to debate, or simply to feel the energy of a man who spoke with a conviction that cut through the fatigue many Germans carried. Hitler's style evolved, but not suddenly. He studied his audiences. He watched which phrases made them lean forward, which made them nod silently, which made them erupt into applause. His speeches became carefully crafted arcs, beginning with grievances that listeners already felt, rising into warnings about threats to the nation, and ending with promises of renewal that left them feeling both anxious and hopeful. It was, in essence, emotional architecture. Yet while speeches gained attention, another part of the movement grew almost unnoticed: the paramilitary wing. Still in its early form, lacking uniforms or clear hierarchy, it consisted mainly of rough men who admired the party's message and believed that physical power was necessary in the streets. These groups clashed with political opponents in city squares or outside meeting halls. Fistfights, broken windows, and scattered confrontations became common. Most incidents were small enough to avoid major newspaper coverage, but they reinforced the party's image as a group willing to defend its beliefs. What made this especially significant was how ordinary citizens reacted. Some were frightened, others were annoyed, but a surprising number viewed these clashes as part of the chaotic times. Violence between political factions had become almost expected, so when the party participated in it, many people barely took notice. This normalization of violence would later become one of the movement's most powerful tools, but its roots were planted quietly in these early years. Behind every speech and every street clash, however, was another layer of work: the development of symbols and rituals. Members experimented with flags, armbands, slogans, and greetings. They understood that symbols could bind people together, giving them a sense of shared identity. At first, these symbols were inconsistent. Designs changed, colors shifted, slogans were tested and discarded. But slowly, a recognizable style emerged, one that appealed to those who felt Germany needed discipline and order. The party also learned to take advantage of local grievances. Each region had its own fears. Rural communities worried about collapsing agriculture. Industrial workers feared unemployment. Veterans felt betrayed, and conservative families lamented the loss of traditional values. The party tailored its message to fit each group, not by changing its core ideas, but by adjusting which issues it emphasized. In doing so, it built a broad coalition of people who believed the party understood their struggles. This period also brought new figures into the movement, individuals who would later become some of the most influential leaders. Men like Ernst Röhm, who played a major role in organizing the paramilitary wing, and Rudolf Hess, whose loyalty to Hitler became almost unquestioning, joined during this time. Their contributions were not yet widely recognized, but they helped form the inner structure that would eventually hold the movement together. If you imagine these years as a storm gathering strength, then these early efforts were the winds that began to swirl quietly before anyone noticed. The party was learning how to create momentum, but it still lacked the conditions needed to truly explode into national prominence. Those conditions would come soon, and when they did, they would transform political frustration into something far more dangerous. As we reach the end of this section, consider the quiet power of repetition, organization, and persistence. How often do societies overlook movements not because they lack potential, but because they grow too slowly to seem threatening? And when we think about the early steps of this rise, we are left with a question. How do we recognize danger when it begins as nothing more than paperwork, pamphlets, meetings, and the slow shaping of a message? In the early years of the 1930s, Germany's collapse did not feel sudden. It felt like a long, exhausting unraveling, the sort of decline that crept quietly into daily life, small enough at first to ignore, then too large to escape. Families who once believed they could endure anything after the Great War found themselves facing something new, something shapeless and frightening: the collapse of the global economy. And while its causes were international, its consequences played out in the most intimate corners of German homes. If you walked through a typical German city in those years, you would see long lines forming outside employment offices before sunrise, stretching around corners, moving slowly, barely speaking. Men who had spent their lives working, men who had built factories, railroads, bridges, now stood in line hoping for temporary labor. Women sold old clothing and family heirlooms at markets to buy food. Children learned to read ration signs before they could read storybooks. It was a time marked not by dramatic events, but by the slow erosion of stability. Banks failed one after another. Businesses closed. Entire industries collapsed. And the worst part was that no one seemed able to stop the bleeding. Politicians argued. Newspapers printed conflicting explanations. Experts disagreed on what should be done. Ordinary citizens felt abandoned in the storm, left to navigate the waves on their own. This growing despair created a strange and dangerous vulnerability. People began searching for answers, not complex answers, not nuanced explanations, but simple ones. They wanted someone to blame and someone to rescue them. This desire, born out of exhaustion rather than anger, created fertile ground for movements that promised certainty in an uncertain world. The rising political movement in Munich recognized this shift quickly. They understood that as the economy collapsed, they did not need to change their message. They only needed to amplify it. The party spoke frequently about national humiliation, corruption, and the failure of the Weimar government. But now, with unemployment climbing and savings vanishing, these criticisms felt sharper. When Hitler spoke about betrayal, people listened more closely. When the party blamed political rivals for Germany's suffering, many nodded without question. Despair makes people receptive to ideas they once would have rejected. But there was something important happening beneath the emotional response, something quieter, something structural. As the economy weakened, people's daily routines changed. Men who had once worked long hours now had endless time. They attended political meetings because there was nowhere else to go. Families read newspapers more often because they needed to understand what was happening. Neighborhood conversations grew more political because survival itself felt connected to government decisions. The social fabric, once focused on work and community life, became tied increasingly to politics. And in this new landscape, the party's message found not just an audience, but a home. One of the most striking features of this period was the rapid growth of street-level activism. Party members organized marches through cities, carrying flags and chanting slogans. These parades were not vast yet, but they were visible. They suggested strength at a time when strength felt impossible. Many Germans saw these processions and felt, if only for a moment, that order and unity were still achievable. The spectacle mattered more than the substance. At the same time, the party began opening food kitchens and local support centers. These centers offered meals, clothing donations, and job information. The assistance was limited, but it was deeply symbolic. While political rivals held debates, the party gave bread. In times of crisis, small gestures carry enormous weight. For some families, this charity was the first tangible sign that the movement could provide real help. But this period also revealed something darker: the party's ability to manipulate frustration. In speeches and writings, they began to direct public fear towards specific groups, political opponents, ethnic minorities, and anyone they labeled as unpatriotic. These accusations were not new, but they became more effective as unemployment soared and communities struggled. Fear needs a target, and the party provided many. Yet it would be wrong to imagine that the party gained influence only by stirring anger. Much of their growth came from presenting themselves as disciplined, organized, and uniquely capable of restoring order. In a world that felt chaotic, the image of men marching in straight lines, wearing matching symbols, and speaking with one voice felt oddly comforting to some citizens. They mistook uniformity for stability. Inside the movement, Leaders recognized that Germany's crisis was giving them momentum they had never previously enjoyed. Membership increased steadily. Donations, though still modest, grew more reliable. The party's newspaper expanded its circulation. Meetings in Munich became larger, and soon branches in other regions began requesting speakers. What had once been a localized movement was now becoming national. But behind this growth lay countless stories of individual struggle. Veterans who could not find work began attending meetings because the party praised their service. Young men frustrated with their uncertain future joined paramilitary groups for a sense of direction. Shopkeepers facing bankruptcy listened to speeches that blamed economic hardship on political betrayal. Each person brought their personal fears, and the party adapted its message to absorb them. Even so, the movement was not yet unbeatable. Many Germans remained skeptical. Some found Hitler's speeches too dramatic. Others distrusted extremist groups on all sides. And many citizens still hoped that the Weimar government would find a solution. The future remained deeply uncertain, shaped by forces far beyond the control of any single movement. Still, the economic collapse had changed the landscape permanently. People were no longer questioning whether the old system was flawed. They were now questioning whether it could survive at all. And in that moment of doubt, the party stepped forward with a confidence that felt persuasive simply because no one else offered it. By the end of these difficult years, a new reality was emerging. The party was no longer just another voice in the noisy political arena. It had become a force that people could not ignore, a force shaped not by sudden brilliance but by the quiet, persistent work that had been unfolding for years. As we close this section, think about how societies respond to widespread hardship. When people feel they are losing control of their lives, they look for someone who claims certainty. But is certainty always a sign of strength, or can it sometimes be a warning? And when a nation collapses slowly, day by day, who decides which voices rise to fill the silence? You have stayed with History in Ashes this far. So before we go any further, if you somehow have not subscribed yet, please do. This channel survives only because of you, and without your support, it will collapse faster than a fragile Weimar coalition. No pressure, just a gentle historical observation. Now, let us move forward. As the 1930s settled in, Germany entered a strange stretch of time that historians often describe as an uneasy quiet, a phrase that does not seem dramatic but fits perfectly. Nothing about daily life felt stable, yet everything moved with an odd sense of routine. People went to work, markets opened, newspapers circulated, and yet beneath this ordinary rhythm lay a deep uncertainty. Every conversation in cafes, on trams, or in offices seemed to drift toward the same two subjects: the economy and the fear of political violence. The streets might look calm one morning, and by evening groups of young men in uniforms would be marching through, chanting slogans that echoed off the tenement walls. During this period, local newspapers began publishing small notices about brawls, street fights, and heated political rallies. These incidents rarely made national news. They were too frequent and too expected. But for the average person living in Berlin, Munich, or Hamburg, these events were reminders that political life had become something people could not avoid even if they tried. You might step out to buy bread and encounter a knot of brown-shirted young men posting announcements on the walls, or you might overhear heated arguments in the bakery line as unemployed workers debated whose fault the crisis really was. Inside private homes, the conversations felt even more emotionally charged. Parents argued about how to keep their children fed while paying rent. Letters from cousins in rural towns often told of neighbors abandoning farms and looking for work in cities already overflowing with the jobless. Grandparents, still remembering the hunger and shortages during the Great War, cautioned younger family members that desperation could push people toward extreme ideas. These warnings, often delivered in quiet voices at dinner tables, carried the weight of lived memory. Meanwhile, the political machinery of the country was grinding slowly and painfully. Coalition governments formed and collapsed with dizzying speed. Cabinet ministers came and went so frequently that ordinary people sometimes struggled to remember who exactly was in charge. Parliamentary sessions grew heated, interrupted by shouting, insults, and walkouts. The lack of political stability did not feel like an abstract problem. It shaped the daily routines of millions. Among the many people who felt the strain were Germany's small business owners. Bakers, butchers, tailors, and shopkeepers often told customers the same story. Prices were rising, supplies were uncertain, and they had no idea what the next month would bring. Some businesses tried to attract customers by offering credit, but this often put them further into debt. Others closed quietly, their windows papered over with a note thanking loyal patrons. Each shuttered shop added to a growing sense that normal life was eroding. Workers felt this erosion in their bones. Factories that once employed thousands were running fewer shifts or closing entirely. Trade unions organized meetings to discuss unemployment benefits and emergency support, but these gatherings frequently devolved into frustration. People wanted answers, not procedures. They wanted stability, not bureaucratic reassurances. It was during these moments when workers felt abandoned that extremist political parties found fertile ground. One of the peculiarities of this era was how rapidly people's everyday routines intertwined with political messages. Posters appeared on lampposts, urging citizens to vote for candidates who promised renewal, strength, and national unity. Radios, once considered a luxury, became a common tool for political persuasion, filling homes with speeches that blended emotion with carefully crafted rhetoric. Even children, playing in schoolyards, repeated slogans they had overheard from adults or seen on banners. The boundary between private life and public ideology grew thin. Amid all this, the rising political movement that would reshape Germany continued to refine its strategy. Organizers held local meetings not only to share ideas, but to learn what ordinary people were worried about: the price of coal, rent increases, the availability of food, the lack of work. These concerns, seemingly mundane, became powerful talking points. By focusing on the frustrations of everyday life, they gained followers who felt that someone finally understood their struggles. At the same time, the movement invested significant effort into creating a sense of belonging. Rallies were not merely political events, they were orchestrated experiences that blended spectacle with message. Flags fluttered, music blared, and speakers delivered fiery speeches under bright lights. People attended not only to listen but to feel part of something larger, something that claimed to restore pride and purpose. Many who joined were not driven by ideology but by the desire to escape isolation and uncertainty. But the growth of one political movement often meant the weakening of others. Parties that once dominated parliamentary debates found themselves losing ground, not because their ideas lacked merit, but because they failed to match the emotional appeal of their rivals. Intellectual arguments, detailed economic plans, and nuanced discussions of policy seemed distant and abstract when compared to the promise of immediate, sweeping change. Meanwhile, Germany's institutions, courts, police departments, civil service offices faced their own pressures. They were stretched thin by rising crime, political unrest, and economic hardship. In some regions, local authorities quietly admitted they could not control political violence. In others, officials sympathized with groups that claimed they were defending the nation's future. This gradual shift in loyalty, often unnoticed by the general public, played a crucial role in shaping the country's path. One of the most significant aspects of daily life during this time was the role of memory. Older generations, haunted by the hardships of the Great War, watched events unfold with a nagging dread. Younger generations, who had only vague childhood recollections of the earlier conflict, saw the world differently. Many of them felt trapped in a society that offered few opportunities. Their frustrations made them more susceptible to promises of revival. Food shortages, while not as severe as during wartime, became increasingly common. Housewives often had to visit multiple shops to gather enough ingredients for a single family meal. Rationing had not returned officially, but in practice many households rationed themselves. Children learned to accept smaller portions, and neighbors frequently shared what little they had. These small acts of kindness helped maintain social cohesion, but they also underscored the severity of the situation. Despite the difficulties, cultural life continued. Theaters staged productions, orchestras performed, and writers published novels that wrestled with the anxieties of the era. Some artists used their work to critique rising authoritarianism. Others sought refuge in nostalgia, depicting idyllic pasts untouched by political conflict. These cultural expressions offered people temporary escape, but they also revealed the deeper fears and hopes shaping society. With each passing year, the political movement that capitalized on fear and frustration grew more confident. Its leaders delivered speeches that blended grievance with bold visions of renewal. They insisted that Germany needed discipline, unity, and strong leadership. Many listeners found comfort in such messages, even if they did not fully embrace the underlying ideology. In times of uncertainty, any certainty can be appealing. Yet, not everyone accepted the message. Many Germans resisted, sometimes quietly and sometimes publicly. Teachers cautioned students against political manipulation. Clergy members delivered sermons urging moral clarity. Workers organized counter-rallies. Journalists wrote articles exposing violence and corruption. These acts of resistance, though often overshadowed, played a crucial role in documenting the truth. Still, the tide was turning. Elections showed shifting loyalties. Formerly dominant parties lost support, while extremist groups gained more seats. The political balance of power began to tilt in a direction that few would have predicted a decade earlier. And as this shift continued, the country found itself edging closer to a transformation that would reshape not only its own history, but the world's. This uneasy balance between fear and hope, between stability and collapse, between memory and ambition, set the stage for changes that were both subtle and profound. As ordinary people tried to maintain their routines, the foundations of their society were quietly shifting beneath their feet. And it leads us to an important question. In a moment where everyday concerns blend so easily with political turmoil, how does a society recognize the turning point before it is too late? By the early years of the 1930s, the political landscape of Germany had shifted from a tangled mess of competing parties into something far more precarious. The center had weakened, the edges had sharpened, and the once fragmented political movement rising on the extreme right had become increasingly confident. This confidence was not simply the product of electoral gains or enthusiastic rallies. It came from a deeper, quieter change that unfolded inside Germany's institutions, workplaces, and households. People were beginning to believe that dramatic change was not only possible, but necessary. In the capital, Berlin, the signs of this transformation appeared in subtle ways first. Civil servants, once known for their stiff formality and devotion to procedural correctness, began adjusting their behavior. Some adopted a more lenient attitude towards certain political groups known for street violence, while remaining strict with others. The files on their desks may have remained the same, but the invisible lines of loyalty were slowly moving. Policemen on night duty occasionally turned a blind eye to attacks on rival groups. Judges became inconsistent in sentencing political offenders, sometimes offering surprisingly light penalties to one faction while imposing heavy punishments on another. These minor discrepancies, scattered across thousands of decisions, would eventually accumulate into a shift of enormous consequence. Ordinary Germans noticed these changes in the same way one notices the gradual dimming of a lamp. At first, nothing seems different. Then, slowly, the shadows lengthen. People who lived in neighborhoods prone to political clashes began to speak with a tone of resignation. They had grown accustomed to the sight of young men patrolling the streets, wearing uniforms that were once considered fringe, but were now increasingly common. The rhythm of daily life adjusted around this presence. Parents instructed children to avoid certain streets after dark. Shopkeepers closed a little earlier. Tram riders sat quietly when rowdy groups boarded, hoping not to attract attention. But deeper forces were at work behind this slow drift toward authoritarianism. Germany's economy, though showing flashes of improvement, remained fragile. International loans provided temporary relief, but underlying issues persisted. Unemployment remained high, industrial output uneven, and public finances strained. This instability created fertile ground for political messages that promised strength, unity, and decisive leadership. The idea of restoring national dignity, something deeply shaken by the Treaty of Versailles, carried powerful emotional weight. Amid this climate, the rising political party continued to refine its tactics. Its leaders understood the value of presenting themselves not as radicals, but as patriots capable of restoring order. They spoke of protecting traditions, defending the nation's future, and rescuing Germany from humiliation. While earlier speeches had leaned heavily on anger and blame, The rhetoric of these years began adopting a calmer, more statesmanlike tone. This shift was deliberate. A movement that appeared violent and unstable would never win over the middle classes, but a movement promising discipline and renewal might. Investments in propaganda grew dramatically. Posters showed smiling workers, families standing proudly, and strong leaders gazing confidently toward a better future. These images were crafted with care, not overly dramatic, not aggressive, but reassuring. In a society exhausted by chaos, reassurance was a powerful currency. Radios broadcast speeches that spoke not of tearing down society, but of building it anew. Newspapers aligned with the movement, published editorials urging citizens to consider stability above all else. Yet beneath this soothing surface lay a machinery of intimidation. Paramilitary groups grew in number and became more organized. Marches were no longer sporadic but scheduled, well-rehearsed, and increasingly large. These displays were designed to convey strength not only to rivals, but to the public. The message was clear. The movement was here to stay, and resisting it would not be easy. At the same time, internal divisions among other political parties deepened. Leaders who should have united against extremism instead spent precious time arguing with one another. Personal rivalries, ideological differences, and conflicting strategies left the opposition scattered. Some believed that cooperating with the rising movement might stabilize the country. Others insisted that doing so would only empower a dangerous force. This disagreement created paralysis at precisely the moment when decisive unity was needed. In cafes and beer halls, these debates played out among ordinary people as well. Some argued that the rising movement's calls for discipline and national revival were exactly what the country needed. Others feared the consequences of granting power to a party that openly encouraged violence and intolerance. Many simply felt tired of political chaos, unemployment, shortages, and uncertainty. This exhaustion made them susceptible to messages that framed authoritarianism as efficiency and strength. Amid all of this, President Paul von Hindenburg, an elderly war hero, found himself at the center of a political storm. His health was declining, his patience thinning, and his hopes for national unity fading. Advisors and politicians approached him with proposals, warnings, and desperate pleas. Each faction sought his endorsement, knowing that his decisions could determine the nation's future. But Hindenburg, cautious by temperament and weary from years of political infighting, struggled to find a path forward. Behind closed doors, negotiations were intense. Influential industrialists, seeking stability for their businesses, expressed support for the rising movement, believing that its leaders would bring discipline to the workforce and protect private enterprise. Conservative politicians believed they could control the movement if they brought it into government, convinced that its leader was more showman than statesman. Newspapers aligned with conservative interests echoed this belief, reassuring readers that the movement's more radical elements would be contained. It was a grave miscalculation. As these negotiations took place, the movement's leadership maintained a careful public image. They spoke calmly of cooperation, unity, and lawful transition. They emphasized respect for traditional institutions and promised to preserve order. These assurances were persuasive to many who desperately wanted to believe them. But privately, plans were forming plans that aimed far beyond coalition participation or parliamentary compromise. In households across Germany, these political developments filtered into daily life in subtle ways. Fathers reading the evening paper at the kitchen table might comment on a recent election result, noting how quickly one party had gained support. Mothers, focused on stretching their weekly food budget, might express cautious hope that a stronger government could improve the economy. Teenagers, caught up in the energy of rallies and marches, spoke about politics with enthusiasm that sometimes alarmed their parents. Even small children, overhearing adult conversations, sensed that something significant was unfolding, though they could not articulate what it was. Meanwhile, letters from rural areas continued to describe hardship. Farmers struggled with low prices, high taxes, and unpredictable weather. Many felt abandoned by the government, which seemed focused on cities and factories. The rising political movement recognized this discontent and reached out, holding rallies in small towns and promising to restore dignity to rural life. These efforts earned them support in regions long ignored by national politics. The combination of rural frustration, urban unemployment, weakened institutions, and political fragmentation created a perfect environment for authoritarian ascent. It was not one dramatic event, but a slow accumulation of small shifts, changes in behavior, adjustments in loyalty, and quiet compromises made in the name of stability. By the time the movement gained significant influence in parliament, many Germans felt that resisting it would only prolong chaos. Some genuinely believed in its promises. Others reluctantly accepted its rise as the price of order. Still others hoped that the system itself would prevent any extreme action. History would later show how tragically mistaken that hope was. For now, though, the nation hovered on the edge of transformation. Conversations grew more cautious. Political jokes disappeared from workplaces. Teachers watched what they said in classrooms. Neighbors avoided discussing certain topics, unsure of who supported which party. The country had not yet fully changed, but the atmosphere had. And this raises an unsettling question. When the air of a nation begins to shift quietly, gradually, almost imperceptibly, how many people recognize the danger before the moment of no return arrives? As Germany moved deeper into the early 1930s, the political tension that had simmered for years began to tighten like a wire pulled slowly, steadily, and with growing pressure. The atmosphere did not explode in dramatic fashion, not yet, but rather shifted in subtle ways that changed how people behaved in their everyday routines. The anticipation of something coming, something inevitable, became almost a part of the air itself. You could feel it in public squares, sense it in hushed conversations, and see it reflected in small details. The way a shopkeeper hesitated before expressing an opinion, the way a tram conductor avoided eye contact with rowdy political groups, the way teachers carefully rearranged their lesson plans. In the corridors of power, the slow-moving political machinery continued its struggle. Negotiations that were meant to produce stable governments instead produced resentment and distrust. Meetings that should have been routine turned into arenas of suspicion. Conservative elites, industrial leaders, and military officials met in quiet rooms where curtains were pulled shut even in the daytime. Cigarette smoke lingered heavy in the air as they debated the future of the nation. Many of these men believed they had found a solution in a political figure who, on paper, seemed energetic, popular, and capable of mobilizing the masses. Their assumption was simple. They believed they could use him. This belief was shared by several senior politicians, particularly those who were weary of democracy's inefficiencies. They saw parliamentary gridlock not as a symptom of national exhaustion, but as a flaw in the system itself. So they sought someone who could energize the public while remaining under the control of traditional elites. They believed that if they brought him into government, surrounded him with experienced advisors, and placed him under the authority of the president, they could manage him. He would, in their minds, be a useful instrument, loud, charismatic, and effective, but ultimately contained. What they underestimated was his ability to turn containment into opportunity. While these political plans took shape behind closed doors, ordinary Germans continued trying to make sense of their own lives. Workers still queued at employment offices, hoping for any opportunity. Housewives stretched food budgets, measuring flour carefully and learning new ways to make simple ingredients last longer. Children walked to school along streets where political posters layered over one another, forming a collage of slogans, bold colors, and faces staring out with promises of renewal. Inside classrooms, teachers wrestled with impossible choices. Some tried to maintain neutrality, reminding students that education was a place for learning, not politics. Others, fearing repercussions, began adjusting their lessons to avoid criticism from new authorities gaining influence in their communities. A few, committed to resisting extremism, quietly encouraged critical thinking, knowing full well the risks that came with such guidance. Universities felt similar pressures. Academic debates that once explored philosophy, economics, and political theory with confidence became cautious. Professors who spoke too openly about the dangers of rising authoritarianism found themselves targeted by student groups aligned with radical parties. Some were shouted down during lectures. Others received anonymous letters threatening consequences if they continued their criticism. A handful resigned and left the country, hoping to continue their work elsewhere. These departures created gaps in Germany's intellectual community that would become painfully clear in the years ahead. Meanwhile, The rising political movement intensified its efforts to portray itself as the defender of the German people. Its leaders traveled from town to town, delivering speeches that blended emotional appeal with promises that resonated deeply in a nation burdened by hardship. They spoke of rebuilding the economy, restoring national pride, and unifying the country. Their words painted a picture of strength, certainty, and confidence, qualities that many Germans felt were missing from the current government. The movement's growing influence was not solely a result of persuasion. It was reinforced by pressure. Paramilitary units marched through towns, their synchronized steps echoing like a warning across cobblestones. The sound of boots hitting pavement became a signature element of political life. These marches were meant to inspire supporters and intimidate opponents. For many citizens, simply staying indoors became a form of silent protest. Even those who opposed extremism often felt trapped. A shopkeeper who refused to display a party poster might find his windows smashed overnight. A journalist who published a critical article might receive a threatening phone call. A family that openly supported rival parties might discover that neighbors became distant and unfriendly. These acts were not always centrally coordinated. Often they came from small groups or individuals acting on their own enthusiasm or hatred. But collectively, they created an atmosphere where resistance felt dangerous. Within the rising movement itself, internal strategy meetings became increasingly focused. Leaders analyzed election results, fine-tuned their messages, and identified which regions needed more attention. They understood that gaining power legally through constitutional means would give them legitimacy, and once legitimacy was secured, they believed they could reshape the nation entirely. In rural villages, life continued at a slow pace, but political currents still reached them. Farm families, burdened by falling prices and limited government support, listened carefully when party speakers arrived in town squares. These speeches often emphasized tradition, unity, and rural pride. They promised to protect the German countryside from neglect and to restore respect for those who worked the land. Many villagers, feeling unseen by city politicians, found comfort in these promises. Even those who were skeptical often felt they had little to lose by supporting the movement. As momentum built, one event stands out as perhaps the clearest sign of the nation's shifting balance. The conversations happening in private homes. Families debated politics more intensely, sometimes dividing along generational lines. Older relatives, shaped by memories of the Great War, often urged caution. Younger family members, energized by the idea of national revival, argued passionately for bold change. The tension between memory and aspiration created friction at dinner tables, where political discussions felt unavoidable. Meanwhile, President Hindenburg, aging and increasingly isolated, faced immense pressure. Advisors urged him to make decisions that would determine the nation's future. Some insisted that the rising political leader must be brought into government to stabilize the country. Others warned that doing so would open the door to authoritarianism. Hindenburg, tired and wary, leaned on the counsel of those closest to him, many of whom believed in the idea of controlling the movement from within government. By the time the president made his decision, the groundwork had been laid. Years of economic hardship, political fragmentation, street violence, and institutional strain had created an environment ripe for a dramatic shift. The nation was ready, some eagerly, some reluctantly, many unknowingly, to accept a leader who promised decisive action. But the crucial question, the one that still inspires reflection today, is how so many individuals, institutions, and communities came to believe that this path was the safer option. Was it fear, hope, exhaustion, or a combination of all three, blended over years of instability? As Germany stood on the brink of transformation, the final pieces were falling into place. Alliances were forming, power was shifting, and behind the scenes, plans were unfolding that would soon accelerate beyond anything the country had seen in its modern history. Which leads us to an unsettling, lingering question. When a society reaches the point where people choose order over freedom, stability over caution, and promises over memory, is there still a moment left to turn back? By the middle of the 1930s, Germany was no longer merely a country recovering from war and economic collapse. It was a nation in transition, though most citizens could not fully perceive the extent of the transformation. Daily life continued in familiar patterns. Shopkeepers opened their stores, students attended classes, families gathered for meals, and trains carried workers to factories and offices. Yet beneath this ordinary rhythm, the structures of power were quietly rearranging themselves, moving toward a form that would soon reshape everything. The mechanisms of governance were central to this change. Ministries and bureaucracies, long accustomed to procedural rules and hierarchical communication, began to operate under new pressures. Some officials, recognizing the rising influence of the political movement, adopted a more cooperative stance toward its leaders. Others, motivated by fear or opportunism, adjusted policies to align with the shifting balance of power. Even small acts approving a permit, delaying a ruling, or turning a blind eye to minor disruptions added to the momentum of transformation. It was in these incremental adjustments, almost invisible at the time, that the groundwork for larger changes was laid. Economic policy also reflected the nation's growing alignment with new political realities. Public works programs, intended to reduce unemployment, were increasingly tied to loyalty and participation in state-approved organizations. Factories that received government contracts often preferred workers affiliated with the rising movement's paramilitary organizations. This subtle integration of politics into everyday economic life encouraged compliance and gradually reshaped societal norms. People who might once have resisted found themselves participating simply to survive or to maintain access to basic opportunities. Meanwhile, propaganda became more sophisticated and pervasive. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and posters were carefully coordinated to ensure consistent messaging. Stories emphasized themes of national revival, unity, and discipline. Citizens heard repeated narratives portraying the nation as under threat from internal and external enemies. This messaging was designed to create both fear and hope simultaneously. Fear of the consequences of inaction, and hope that strong leadership could restore order. It was a psychological strategy, one that gradually conditioned public perception and shaped the choices people made in their daily lives. Cultural life, too, adapted to these changes. Theatres and cinemas reflected prevailing political currents, often emphasizing themes of loyalty, heroism, and social cohesion. Art exhibitions celebrated traditional values while subtly discouraging dissenting perspectives. Schools increasingly incorporated patriotic instruction into their curricula, presenting the nation's past and present through a lens that aligned with state messaging. Even leisure activities, sporting events, local festivals, and parades became infused with political symbolism, reinforcing the idea that public participation was tied to national identity. In neighborhoods and households, subtle behavioral changes mirrored the broader societal shifts. Families discussed politics more cautiously, avoiding controversial topics in public spaces. Children learned to recognize symbols, slogans, and uniforms, understanding their social significance before fully grasping the underlying ideology. Everyday interactions, greetings, conversations, and gestures began to reflect a growing awareness of social alignment. Compliance with public norms was not always voluntary. It was often a pragmatic response to a complex and changing environment. These adjustments were reinforced by the presence of paramilitary groups. Their activities were no longer random or isolated. Organized marches, demonstrations, and patrols became increasingly common in both urban and rural areas. These groups served multiple functions. They enforced discipline within their ranks, projected power outward to intimidate opponents, and created a sense of security among supporters. For ordinary citizens, their visibility reinforced the perception that the movement was not temporary or marginal, but an enduring part of political life. The judicial system, meanwhile, faced new pressures. Courts became arenas where legal decisions were influenced by the broader social and political climate. Judges, often concerned with preserving their positions or ensuring social stability, issued rulings that reflected the shifting power dynamics. Cases involving political dissenters were treated with increasing severity, while actions aligned with the movement were frequently overlooked or excused. Over time, this created a legal environment that normalized partiality and eroded the notion of impartial justice. As these changes unfolded, the rising political movement consolidated its organizational structure. Leadership hierarchies were clarified, communication channels standardized, and recruitment strategies refined. Membership grew steadily, and the movement's presence expanded geographically, even in areas where initial support had been minimal. Local chapters organized meetings, disseminated literature, and engaged with communities. These efforts were meticulously planned, ensuring that the movement maintained both visibility and influence. Despite this outward growth, internal dynamics remained critical. Leaders debated strategy, coordinated messaging, and managed emerging conflicts within the organization. The paramilitary wing required discipline and oversight, while political strategists worked to maximize the impact of rallies, speeches, and publications. Behind the scenes, meticulous attention was paid to detail: who would speak where, which regions would receive focused attention, and how to respond to opposition activities. This level of organization, often invisible to the public, was essential for sustaining momentum. One of the most significant challenges faced by ordinary citizens during this period was navigating the new social expectations. Compliance with emerging norms often meant balancing personal convictions with practical necessities. A baker might display a flag or symbol to protect his business, even if he privately disagreed with the ideology it represented. Families adjusted social gatherings to avoid conflict. Neighbors monitored each other cautiously, aware that rumors or perceived disloyalty could have real consequences. These subtle pressures created a society in which participation, conformity, and vigilance became intertwined with daily survival. In parallel, economic hardship remained a pervasive influence. Though some recovery programs offered relief, unemployment and underemployment continued to affect millions. Families relied on small-scale ingenuity, bartering, and community support networks to manage daily needs. In this context, political messaging promising stability, opportunity, and protection resonated with those seeking practical solutions. The interplay between economic necessity and political persuasion was subtle but powerful. Survival itself became intertwined with alignment to the rising movement's agenda. Across Germany, ordinary experiences, walking to work, buying food, attending school, participating in community events, were increasingly framed by political context. Public life became a theatre in which citizens were both audience and participants. Choices that once seemed personal, expressing an opinion, attending a meeting, displaying a symbol, took on political significance. In this environment, individual behavior contributed, often unknowingly, to the broader consolidation of influence. This complex interplay of economic stress, social pressure, institutional adaptation, and political messaging highlights a critical historical lesson. The rise of authoritarian influence is rarely abrupt. It is often the product of gradual shifts, imperceptible in isolation, but cumulatively transformative. Ordinary people, making daily decisions in response to immediate pressures, collectively shape the trajectory of a nation. In Germany's case, these decisions, small and often mundane, created the conditions that allowed a radical movement to move from the margins to the center of power. By the end of this period, Germany was positioned on the edge of an irreversible transformation. Streets, schools, workplaces, and government institutions reflected a society adapting to new norms. Political influence had extended far beyond rallies and speeches into the routines of daily life. The nation had not yet crossed the point of no return, but the structures that would enable authoritarian consolidation were firmly in place. And this brings us to a question worth pondering. When everyday choices, small acts of compliance, and subtle adjustments to social pressures accumulate, how aware are ordinary citizens of the historical forces they help set in motion? At what point do adaptation and survival inadvertently pave the way for the extraordinary rise of power? By the mid-1930s, Germany had entered a period in which the once unthinkable was becoming increasingly plausible. Citizens who had grown up during the post-war years and endured economic instability now faced a political environment where the ordinary routines of life were intertwined with growing authoritarian influence. Markets, schools, offices, and even public transportation were slowly becoming infused with subtle signals of the shifting power structure. These signals were not always dramatic. Sometimes they were as simple as a poster on a lamppost, a new rule in a factory, or a speech played on the radio, but their cumulative effect was profound. In cities like Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg, Ordinary streets became theaters for political messaging. Posters, banners, and flags were displayed with increasing frequency, their imagery carefully crafted to convey stability, strength, and unity. Even when no one spoke directly about politics, the environment itself reminded citizens of a powerful movement that claimed to represent the nation's best interests. Children who walked to school daily absorbed these symbols, and adults found themselves adjusting their routines, conversations, and even gestures in response. Factories and workplaces mirrored this shift. Employers increasingly considered loyalty to the rising political movement when making hiring decisions. Workers who were affiliated with paramilitary groups or local chapters of the movement often received preferential treatment. This subtle integration of politics into economic opportunity forced many ordinary citizens to navigate a complicated terrain, participate, and gain access to employment or risk isolation and disadvantage. Over time, what began as pragmatic compliance gradually normalized broader acceptance of the movement's influence. Meanwhile, universities and cultural institutions experienced similar pressures. Professors, artists, and intellectuals navigated an environment where criticism of the political movement could result in harassment, professional setbacks, or public scrutiny. Curricula, publications, and exhibitions were often adjusted to reflect prevailing ideological expectations. Students, sensing the stakes, adopted cautious behaviors. Some embraced the ideology, others silently resisted, and many simply observed. This combination of observation, adaptation, and partial participation created a generational effect, shaping social attitudes in ways that would persist for years. Within households, the political atmosphere influenced family dynamics. Conversations at the dinner table were cautious, sometimes guided by fear, sometimes by social expectation. Younger family members, influenced by rallies, posters, and radio broadcasts, often held opinions that differed from those of elders who remembered the hardships of the Great War. These generational tensions, while subtle, contributed to a society increasingly attuned to ideology and loyalty. Children absorbed lessons in compliance alongside formal education, and over time these informal lessons reinforced broader societal trends. The judicial system continued to reflect the shift in power. Judges and prosecutors faced increasing pressure to interpret laws in ways that aligned with the rising movement's agenda. Cases involving political dissenters received harsher penalties, while actions aligned with the movement were frequently overlooked. This erosion of impartiality signaled to the public that the rules of society were now being shaped not by abstract principles, but by practical power. Ordinary citizens gradually internalized this lesson. Loyalty and alignment with dominant forces were often more consequential than strict adherence to law. Economic conditions remained a persistent undercurrent, shaping both behavior and perception. While some recovery programs provided temporary relief, unemployment and economic uncertainty persisted. Families relied on community networks, ingenuity, and limited social support to survive. In this context, political promises of stability and prosperity resonated strongly. Many citizens, facing immediate hardship, were willing to tolerate or even support actions they might previously have opposed, so long as they believed those actions offered protection, opportunity, or predictability. The growing paramilitary presence amplified these pressures. Parades, demonstrations, and street patrols became increasingly organized and predictable. Their visibility served dual purposes: intimidating opponents and reinforcing the impression of authority among supporters. In many towns, encounters with these groups became a routine part of life, shaping how citizens behaved in public spaces. Compliance, once voluntary, became a practical necessity, further embedding the movement's influence into daily routines. Within the rising political movement itself, meticulous planning ensured that growth continued steadily. Leadership structures were clarified, communication networks streamlined, and membership recruitment intensified. Local chapters were empowered to organize events, distribute literature, and engage with communities in ways tailored to regional concerns. This decentralized yet coordinated approach allowed the movement to expand its reach without losing cohesion, gradually embedding itself into the social fabric of both urban and rural Germany. Despite this expansion, Opposition persisted. Socialists, communists, liberals, and other groups continued to resist, both publicly and privately. Underground publications circulated critiques of the movement, and small-scale demonstrations occasionally disrupted events. Teachers, clergy, and journalists sought to preserve independent thought, even as the social and political environment became increasingly hostile. These pockets of resistance, while limited in scale, were vital for maintaining alternative perspectives within society. Yet the combined effect of social pressure, economic necessity, political messaging, and institutional alignment created a landscape in which the rising movement's ideology became increasingly normalized. Ordinary citizens, acting pragmatically to protect themselves, inadvertently reinforced the structures of influence. Communities adapted to the new reality, often without fully recognizing the historical magnitude of the changes taking place around them. The lines between voluntary participation and coerced compliance blurred, and society as a whole began to shift. By now, the movement had not only achieved widespread visibility, but had also embedded itself in the routines, perceptions, and behaviors of daily life. Schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, and households reflected the cumulative effects of years of incremental influence. Citizens had adjusted their expectations, interactions, and personal strategies in ways that supported both the perception and the reality of emerging authority. This slow, almost imperceptible integration demonstrated the power of gradual societal transformation. And so, as Germany approached the final years before the consolidation of power, ordinary life carried the subtle imprint of extraordinary historical forces. Daily routines, once neutral, had become intertwined with political expectations. Cultural institutions, economic activity, and educational practices all reflected the influence of the rising movement. The country had not yet fully crossed the point of irreversible change, but the structures enabling that change were firmly in place. This leads to a sobering question for reflection. When influence seeps into everyday routines, when ordinary behaviors and practical decisions align with emergent power structures, how aware are individuals of the role they play in history? At what point does pragmatism become complicity, and can a society recognize its own transformation before it becomes irreversible? By the late 1930s, Germany had been transformed in ways both visible and subtle. The streets, schools, workplaces, and neighborhoods no longer resembled the fragmented, uncertain nation of a decade earlier. Instead, they reflected a society gradually aligned with the structures and ideologies of a rising authoritarian movement. Ordinary life, shopping, working, attending school, or traveling carried embedded signs of compliance, adaptation, and surveillance. The change was not sudden or explosive. It was the product of years of incremental shifts, small decisions, and subtle pressures that accumulated until the ordinary and the extraordinary became inseparable. In cities, the public sphere bore the clearest mark of this transformation. Posters, flags, and symbols appeared in nearly every square, tram, stop, and storefront. Public buildings displayed portraits of leaders whose image was designed to inspire loyalty, obedience, and admiration. Paramilitary groups, once marginal, were now an accepted presence, their marches coordinated and widely attended. Ordinary citizens learned to navigate these spaces carefully, observing rules that were never fully written but enforced through social expectation and subtle intimidation. A shopkeeper might display a flag not out of belief, but because the alternative potential scrutiny, harassment, or exclusion was too costly. Over time, these pragmatic choices normalized the presence of authority and ideology in everyday life. Economic life mirrored these transformations. Public works programs provided employment, but often with strings attached. Participation in sanctioned organizations, demonstration of loyalty, or adherence to political expectations. Factories, offices, and farms increasingly rewarded compliance and punished dissent. Citizens discovered that survival and opportunity were linked to alignment with the dominant political movement. Even individuals who remained privately skeptical found themselves negotiating a new reality in which the boundaries between personal choice and political expectation were blurred. Compliance became an unspoken necessity. Cultural institutions, too, reflected the cumulative effects of years of influence. Theatres, libraries, and museums adopted practices aligned with the movement's narrative. Curriculum adjustments, thematic exhibitions, and public performances reinforced messages of unity, loyalty, and national revival. Art, literature, and music, once diverse and experimental, shifted toward themes that emphasized tradition, heroism, and community over individual expression. Universities, long spaces for debate and critical thought, adapted as well. Professors moderated lectures, students learned coded forms of expression, and intellectual freedom increasingly became conditional upon perceived loyalty. In this subtle way, culture itself became a tool of reinforcement. Within households, the social dynamics of adaptation were equally profound. Families monitored the behavior of children, neighbors, and relatives. Generational tensions persisted, with older family members often recalling the chaos and hardships of prior decades and younger generations, responding to the energy and promises of change. Conversations became measured. Opinions that might once have been shared openly were now restrained, expressed in private, or reserved entirely. The microcosm of the household mirrored the broader transformation. Survival, social cohesion, and adaptation intertwined with the political environment. Religious institutions were not immune. Clergy and congregations navigated a delicate balance between moral guidance and public expectation. Sermons began to reflect patriotic and nationalistic themes, often subtly emphasizing obedience and unity. Some religious leaders resisted overtly, while others adapted their messaging to maintain their communities. The influence of faith persisted, but the framework in which it operated had shifted. Even deeply personal spaces of reflection and community became sites where societal transformation was felt. The judicial system, having undergone years of incremental adjustments, now clearly reflected new power dynamics. Courts interpreted laws with deference to dominant authority. Dissenting voices faced harsher treatment, and enforcement of regulations often favored supporters of the movement. Ordinary citizens internalized these lessons, recognizing that legal compliance and social alignment were not separate but interconnected. Small decisions, like participating in sanctioned activities or avoiding controversial topics, cumulatively reinforced the broader societal structure. Political consolidation reached a decisive stage during this period. The combination of legal mechanisms, popular support, and organizational control enabled the movement to assert authority nationally. Elections, though still formally conducted, were heavily influenced by propaganda, intimidation, and administrative oversight. Voters often faced limited options, and participation itself was shaped by years of social conditioning. As the movement assumed formal governmental control, the structures and norms that had been gradually established allowed its influence to extend rapidly and deeply into every sector of life. Resistance persisted, though increasingly constrained. Underground publications circulated discreetly. Small groups met in private to discuss opposition strategies. Individual acts of defiance continued, whether in classrooms, workplaces, or households. Yet these pockets of dissent were often isolated, fragmented, and under constant surveillance. The cumulative pressures of economic dependency, social conformity, political messaging, and legal enforcement made sustained opposition extremely difficult. Even those motivated by principle frequently found themselves navigating a landscape where survival required accommodation. One of the most profound aspects of this period was the normalization of power structures that had once seemed extraordinary. Citizens adapted to new rules, expectations, and hierarchies, not through dramatic transformation, but through countless small, ordinary decisions. Compliance, participation, and adaptation were often pragmatic rather than ideological, yet collectively they enabled the rapid consolidation of authority. Streets, workplaces, classrooms, and homes bore witness to the quiet accumulation of influence, a reminder that history often advances through ordinary acts as much as through extraordinary events. By the end of this stage, Germany had reached a critical point. Society, institutions, and daily routines were deeply aligned with the new power structures. Citizens who had once viewed authoritarian ideas as distant or extreme found themselves operating within a system in which those ideas defined the contours of public and private life. The nation had not only accepted a new government, but had internalized the norms and behaviors that reinforced it. The transformation was not complete overnight. It had been decades in the making, shaped by economic hardship, social adaptation, political strategy, and subtle pressures that collectively reshaped the country. And so, as Germany entered the final stage of its political and social consolidation, one lingering question remains. How do ordinary choices, made day by day in response to hardship, fear, and uncertainty, contribute to the rise of extraordinary power? When survival and pragmatism guide behavior, can citizens recognize the moment when their adaptation becomes complicity? And in the quiet accumulation of small decisions, who truly notices the turning point of history?